Morning, everybody. What are some common traditions, social expectations, duties, obligations that is quite common and many of us know about? Now, interestingly, many of these traditions are easily good, beneficial, and helpful, but they can also easily be abused. So, what are a few of them? What about age expectations? When you're at this age, you need to be married, you need to have X number of kids, you need to have this amount in savings, etc., etc. Or pasalubong. When you go somewhere, you need to bring this or else. How about fiestas? Pag fiesta, you need to open the doors and you need to feed whoever comes in, even total strangers. And if you don't have money, you make a loan from the bank. There are so many things. And some of them are good, some of them are fun, some of them harmless, and yet some of them can be abused. The reason why we're talking about this today is because our sermon today and our topic is actually a little bit challenging. It's challenging for two reasons. First, the topic can be very contentious. It can be very controversial, the topic itself. Secondly, the reason why it's challenging is because many of us already know so many of these principles and concepts. The difficulty is in applying them in our daily lives. So, before we jump in, I just want to say that we are still in the Gospel series, and yet we are looking at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, however, has already talked a lot between what happened last week and what happened this week. So our sermon last week, we talked about mercy and sacrifice and joy and all of that. Now, in between the events last week and the events in this sermon, John chapter 5 actually happens. And John chapter 5 is still connected. Why? Because Jesus heals an invalid in the Sabbath, and then he claims to be equal with God on the Sabbath, and he was almost killed on the Sabbath. People tried to lynch him. Then he speaks more about his equality with God. John chapter 5, verse 19, all the way to 47, if you go back to there. So if you're trying to listen to the entire gospel series chronologically, you listen to last week's sermon, then you go to John 5 in our YouTube, then you come back here. Okay, so we're going to go straight into the text because it's a little bit lengthy. Matthew 12, verse 1, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath again. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? When he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" This reminds me of a certain story in a certain high school which I will not mention. So during that high school season, diba, there are rows and there are students in rows, right? So the teacher of that high school did not want to check all the papers. So what they would normally do is they would say, pass your paper counterclockwise. So row 1 and row 2, row 3 and 4. Do you know this? Row 1 and 2 clockwise, 3 and 4 clockwise. And then they check each other's papers. So the students of this class decided, at least row 1 and row 2, that they would check each other's papers and give each other passing grades. So whatever the teacher said was the correct answer, they did not care. They would just make sure that the average of row 1 and row 2 would be the same. In that way, we all passed. So what's the point here? There was what you call collusion among a few rows to give each other passing grades, but these were not legit. They were self-assessed. They were biased. They thought that they were doing themselves a favor, but in the end, they're not really learning anything. They're not really growing, right? Now, in context, on the surface level, it looks like the issue here is about the Sabbath. It's a Sabbath, it's a Sabbath, Sabbath, Sabbath. But if we go deeper, the real issue is misplaced loyalties and loving a false means to attain a false, biased basis for morality. It wasn't really about the Sabbath. The real issue was they looked for a way to collude with one another and sabot-sabot and decide, guys, so among us, here's our standard, ha? We all give each other passing grades. We are row 1 and row 2. That was what the Pharisees did. They relied on each other and made rules for themselves and for others to have a certain standard of morality, which they knew that they could either abuse or they could pass by colluding. Many fraternities do the same thing. Many fraternities, for example, if there's a frat member who does something wrong, the other frat members don't care who's right or who's wrong. They will side with their frat member. They will justify whatever wrong he did simply because he's a member of the frat. He's a member of the cult. He's a member of the church. It's loyalty to the group. Loyalty to group think, which is no longer biblical. Now, if we study the Talmud, this is not the Bible, the Talmud, okay? If you walk 2,000 steps on the Sabbath, it's considered work and you're sinning. Can you imagine that? It's a Sabbath day, 1, 2, 3. Can you imagine 1,999? Patay. Someone carry me. You know? So, you'd be sinning. Ironically, Jesus walked everywhere and they all followed Jesus. So they also walked the same distance that Jesus walked. So they should have been guilty of the same stuff. But look, they never questioned Jesus about his travels because they knew they were also guilty. They only questioned Jesus about the things that they knew they were not guilty of. So you see the bias there. It's very technical and very smart, but it's really very false. For rabbis, Jesus and his followers on the grain fields were guilty of several things. First, they were guilty of quote-unquote harvesting. Number 2, processing. Number 3, preparing food on the Sabbath. And number 4, they did all of this with unclean hands. None of them washed. So according to the Talmud, not the law of Moses, but the Talmud, the law of man. The law of man, Jesus and his disciples were sinning. Interestingly, this is not God's law. This is man's law. The response of Jesus is very interesting. This always bugged me before. What did Jesus really mean when he referred to King David in the past? So I had to read 1 Samuel, and this was during the time when King David was being chased by King Saul, and King Saul was trying to murder the dude, right, through a spear, all of that. And so Jonathan said, Dad's trying to kill you. So he ran away, right? He gets into the temple, and then he talked to Abiathar the priest. And it's like, what are you doing here? It's like, I'm on a mission for the king, when actually he was evading the king, right? And then he was like, hey, do you have food? We don't have food. And so the priest said, well, have you guys kept yourself from women? Like, yeah, as with all our errands from the king, we stay away from women, This is a holy, sacred mission. So like, okay, well, here's the sword from Goliath, and here's some food, And he was like, are you guys, are you pure? And everything is like, oh, we're always pure when we go on our trips. So King David actually lied to the priest to get the Goliath sword and the showbread, or the bread of the presence. And so in my mind, King David was actually lying, and so he was actually sinning here. And he wasn't allowed to eat this, so he's guilty. So why is Jesus now saying he's not? Right? It's a little confusing. Interestingly, if you look at traditions of the rabbis, they actually excuse King David of this. The Talmud says King David was innocent. But if you read the law of Moses, he's lying, and that's not for him to eat. In fact, remember when the ark fell and there was this guy who caught the ark by instinct? Can you picture it? Like, he didn't sin, he didn't do anything, just don't touch the ark. He's like, oh, it fell. And then he gets killed. King David lies, eats the bread, totally fine. What's happening here? Is there bias? Is there, So the rabbis actually accuse King David. I mean, excuse. They don't accuse. They excuse him. Now, if you really think about it, or when we exegete, when we analyze, the Pharisees viewed King David as a great hero. For them to be heard accusing King David would have been an issue, because King David was viewed like as a patriarch. So in the Philippines, it would be similar to if people said anything negative about Jose Rizal. People would be like, what, Jose Rizal? You're against Jose Rizal? Like, it would be like an issue. But the issue is actually deeper. The bread of the presence was placed on the table in the holy place of the tabernacle. This symbolized Yahweh's provision and care for His people. This is not food for God. This symbolized God's food for people. Okay? Now, at the same time, this was weekly nourishment that's exclusively for the priests. The priests were supposed to eat this. King David was not a priest during his time. He was a king. He wasn't a priest. That was very clear. The Levites were the priests. The Aaronic line were priests, not King David. So, when he ate that, and the Pharisees knew it, and they would excuse them for the unlawful eating of this bread in the past, it showed the bias of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were so biased that they're willing to excuse someone who actually broke the law. Why? He broke the law because he was a victim of an actual crime, which was the King Saul attempting to murder him without just cause. So he's someone who is desperate and quote-unquote doing criminal acts against the ceremonial stuff in the temple because he needed mercy from God. So you see that the whole issue of mercy is there again. Additionally, Jesus said the priests eat during the Sabbath what was prepared, and they do certain acts that violate their man-made laws. You're not supposed to cook. You're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to do that. These are all man-made laws. And Jesus is saying, look, when you make your own man-made laws, don't you violate them yourselves during the Sabbath when you eat these things in the temple? You do certain acts that are actually biased. But because you're all Pharisees, you're all members of the same frat, you're row 1 and you're row 2. So you're excusing each other. So for David who sinned, you show bias because one is a patriarch of sorts, not really a patriarch, but a national hero. And 2, he needed mercy. You guys are excusing yourselves from your own law because you're biased for one another. You guys don't need mercy. You guys just have to follow your own laws, but you all break it. Again, the row 1, row 2 principle. How much more should they show bias, or not really bias, but allow Jesus and His disciples to eat when there's no Mosaic Law being broken? You see, if you really read the Mosaic Law, it just says don't do work on the Sabbath. It doesn't say 1,999 steps is the maximum. It doesn't say all these other things. Just don't do work. Now, how do you interpret that kind of work? It's career work. It's business work. It's not like if you put food in a microwave, that's not quote-unquote work. Because you're going to eat. You see, so there's no law, Mosaic Law. There were man-made, hypocritical religious laws. Furthermore, Jesus says in verse 6, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. Obviously, he's talking about himself. And that's why he again says, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I'm not going to belabor the point on mercy and sacrifice because we preached on this last week. So we're going to focus more on the heart behind this. Now, Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. FYI, if you do a word search on Sabbath, you're going to find it a lot in the Old Testament, obviously. You're going to find a lot of word search in the Gospels because a lot of controversies happened during the Sabbath, or they discussed the Sabbath or talked about it in the Gospels. You'll find a lot of that in the book of Acts. But it's not really doctrinal. It's more, during the Sabbath, here's what happened. Not contentious, not doctrinal. And then in the epistles, you will not find a single word Sabbath from all the epistles, all the way, Romans, Corinthians, etc., 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 all the way down to Colossians, where it says, do not allow anyone to judge you or make a judgment on you based on new moon festivals and Sabbaths. The next mention is Hebrews, where Christ says He is our Sabbath. He is our rest. So notice, in the entire New Testament, the Sabbath is no longer an issue because it's been fulfilled. That's FYI. So imagine how shocked the Jews were when Jesus refers to Himself as the Son of Man, which is the Messiah, prophesied by Old Testament prophets, and now He's changing the law. He's saying, okay guys, you heard about the Sabbath from Moses. Now I'm saying it's different. I'm fulfilling it. Let me just make something very clear, especially for us as a church. Doctrinal taha. And this is a little controversial. Whenever you read the New Testament's treatment of the Mosaic Law, Jesus and the apostles are not reinterpreting the law of Moses. They are not giving the deeper meaning of the law of Moses, like other churches teach. They are not giving the true meaning of the Mosaic Law. Not. What is Jesus and the apostles really doing? Jesus is fulfilling the law of Moses, and the apostles are affirming what Jesus has done. So don't think they're just giving the deeper meaning as some other churches would teach. It's not the deeper meaning. The meaning of the law of Moses is whatever the law of Moses says. When Jesus talks about, here's what I'm saying, He's not saying, here's the deeper meaning. He's saying, that's the law of Moses, this is the law of Christ. New priesthood, new law. When there's a change of priesthood, there's a change of law. He's not saying when there's a change of priesthood, there's a new meaning of the law, new interpretation, deeper whatever. It's not. The law has been changed. We're under the law of Christ. We're not under the new meaning, new interpretation of the law of Moses according to Christ. It's not it. So just something to clarify. Why is this so important? Why am I explaining this? Here's where it gets a little contentious, a little controversial. This is not to stir the pot, okay? But we're here in this text, so we have to address it. Many today are still tempted to be either like a frat or a cult by colluding with each other and giving each other biased assessments to be moral. In other words, they want to be loyal to Moses in following the Sabbath laws, and they even call it a means of grace when it is not. A Sabbath doctrine is not a means of grace. If you treat the Sabbath as a day, it's not a means of grace. May it be Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whatever day, it's not a means of grace. The means of grace is actually being with God, fellowshipping with one another as a church, not the day, not the observance of a schedule. I hope that's clear. The problem is when we make man-made laws that are not in the Bible, and then we call them creeds. And then we say, if we follow this creed, we are moral and not sinning. And then row 1 and row 2. Are you following this creed? Yes, so am I. So you're moral and I'm moral. But if they don't follow it, they're not like us. You see the difference there. Now, I'm not saying that all man-made laws are bad. I'm not saying all creeds are bad. When we say man-made, when we say creeds or creedolatry, it's when a creed is created that has no real biblically exegeted evidence, which requires certain things that God does not. That's when it becomes a man-made creedolatrous thing. Okay? The problem is when we consider it sin to disobey modern-day creeds when it's not even in Scripture. How is that any different from the Pharisees who made their own creeds during their time? It doesn't matter what you call it. We can call it the Pharisaical law. We can call it the Pharisaical creed. We can call it today's laws, man-made creed, statements of faith, whatever you want to call it. If it's any kind of set of rules, paper or not, document or not, church culture or not, and that becomes your basis for morality, when it's not in the Bible, exegetically based, that's a problem. That becomes row 1, row 2, colluding. When we call it sin to miss or disobey certain man-made Sabbath rules of the 21st century, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, Jesus says mercy, not sacrifice. To make it functional, just imagine this. A family man has an infant baby and a wife at home. He loses his job. He is desperate for work. He finally gets an offer to go on construction work on Sundays. Sunday construction work. That's not considered a work of necessity. But his family needs milk. Are we going to say he's sinning? What does he need? He needs mercy. When everyone will say, you and your family need to sacrifice because it's Sunday, it's the Lord's day, you gotta go to church. You gotta not go to that Sunday work construction. Sacrifice. And Jesus says God requires mercy. You see, that's where it becomes dangerous and a little bit scary. I talk about this because we're here and because up to today, it's still a temptation. If it's not a doctrine, it can be a church culture. If you visit any other church, you're sinning. If you check out this or that church or this or that doctrine, hala. And then they talk bad about you. If you listen to YouTube sermons by other preachers, even if they're sound and good and doctrinally okay, why? What are you trying to say? You don't like our sermons? Blah, blah, blah. Chill. We gotta... It's such a controversial thing. But I've seen so many churches become so cultic. As long as you just even consider looking at a sermon YouTube of some other church, halaka, issue na. Huh? Let's be very careful with this. Maybe we're not tempted to follow day schedules for the Sabbath, but we're tempted to think of other things to give ourselves a sense of morality. More ministry, more church work, more evangelism, more prayer, more Bible study, more this, more that. If I do more, I'm more moral. So moral, right? Now, I'm not saying that these things are wrong. Ministry, Bible study, these are all good. Actually, these are, in a sense, what helps us grow. But it's very tricky. This topic is actually very tricky because the question has to do with motives. And there's a balance. And I'm sure you've been there. Sometimes, you guys notice this, sometimes you're so tired, you're so exhausted, you're just all spent. You just feel like, Lord, wala na jud, I'm hurot. Drink offering, cup, empty na gyud, actually dry. There are times you have to take a step back and say, Lord, I can't do ministry for now, I gotta recharge. But there are also times when you're super empty and you do ministry, that is how you get recharged. Yeah? For me, personally, I've experienced both. I've experienced being so burnt out doing ministry, I needed a sabbatical. But there were also times when I'm so dry, and then when I do ministry, that's when I'm suddenly full back. Doing the ministry, doing the work of God. Because the joy of the Lord is strength. And so this is tricky. Because we tend to do a default thing, I'm tired, so I will not do ministry at all. Others naman, I'm exhausted, I need to do more ministry. The issue is, the question is not, if you're exhausted and tired, should I do this or not? Should I do this or that? That's not the question. The question is, what's your motive? Is your motive to get recharged in the Lord because you want to experience God's grace, God's joy, and you want to get back to that fellowship with God? Is that your motive? Or is your motive, I just want to remove this feeling and sensation of exhaustion. What's the motive? That's really the question here. That's why it's a tricky sermon. It's a very challenging topic because motives can be very, very confusing sometimes. Sometimes our own motives deceive ourselves. And we deceive ourselves as well. We tell ourselves some really weird stories just to believe a certain something. So it's tricky. Verse 9. He went on from there and entered their synagogue. And okay, guys, this is God orchestrating events just to prove a point. Okay, so it's on the Sabbath. He enters the synagogue, and synagogue has, so everybody's there. It's like a crowd. It's like a big crowd. It's a synagogue in the Sabbath or during the Sabbath. And a man was there with a withered hand. And so they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Like, can you, it's like God is really just, okay, man withered hand, you be right there. Sabbath day, crowd, all this issue is coming to the forefront of the consciousness of all the people. Let's do this. And so Jesus is there and they ask him to accuse him. Look at verse 11. He said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Now, sheep is actually for business. It's not, for them, sheep was not a pet. It's not like a cat, okay? It's agricultural business. So, this is actually really the do not work. This is really the work issue. Because it's like saying, who among you, if you have a photocopying business and your photocopier is jammed, would you not repair it? That's what Jesus is actually saying. Who among you who has a plantation of cows and one is sick, would you not give it medicine? That's really business. This is a business issue now. And yet Jesus is saying, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out. How much more value is a man than a sheep? Now, here, the issue here, Jesus doesn't say, which one of you who has a sheep who is being attacked by a mountain lion or wolves? Like if a sheep falls into a pit, it's not going to die. Right? It's not an imminent danger. And yet you're going to go out there for your business and you're going to do this. You're going to help the sheep, right? So Jesus is saying, you guys are excusing the whole sheep issue. You're excusing the sheep issue, but you're going to not give a favorable response for a man with a withered hand who needs mercy. Are you actually saying that sheep is more important or more valuable than human beings? That's what Jesus is really saying. Here's the irony of this. When you think about the Sabbath and you think about the sheep is an agricultural asset in an agrarian life. But they're also living creatures. And so what Jesus is actually saying here is you will have mercy on the sheep. Why are you having mercy on the sheep? Because it's in a pit. What pain does a sheep go through when it's a pit? It's just the pain of, I'm not with my fellow sheep. It's not like it's harmed. It's not like, right? It's not like it's harmed and it's bleeding to death and what's the word? Baaing? Right? Bleating. There you go. It's bleating. Bah, bah, bah. Like, I'm dying here. It's not like that. It's just, I'm scared. I'm in a pit. I'm all alone. It's like a cat outside your door meowing. Meow, meow. It's not dying. It's just meow, meow. And you're like, oh. You show mercy for that. And a human, you don't? All for what? The answer to the all for what, at least for the Pharisees, is their loyalty to their traditions, loyalty to their culture, social, religious expectations. Let me give a few more insights to this. Healing was prohibited by Pharisees during the Sabbath because if you healed someone, you had to grind herbs. You had to bandage a wound. So for them, it was considered quote-unquote work. For God, that's not work. It's just showing mercy. It's just helping someone else. Here are a few more things that the Pharisees actually forbade during the Sabbath. Writing, erasing, tearing, conducting business transactions, shopping, cooking, baking, kindling a fire, gardening, washing your clothes or laundry, carrying anything more than 6 feet in a public area, 6 feet in a public area, of course, 2,000 steps, moving anything with your hand, even indirectly with a broom. If you move anything with your hand, even if indirectly, that's sin. If there's a broken bowl, a flower in or flowers in a vase, candles on a table, raw food, a rock, or a button that has fallen off, you can move it with your elbow or your breath, but not your hand. So if something falls, or elbow, maybe feet, not hand. It's so silly. It's just as silly as, for today, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or sunrise to sunset, or at day. It's just as silly, isn't it? If you really think about it. Here's the implication. When we make man-made laws and we value them, even if they go against Scripture, we end up killing people. How do we know we end up killing people? I'm going to jump to Matthew 12, verse 13 and 14. That's right there anyway. It says, then he said to them, where is that? Okay, there. He said to them, stretch out your hand. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. See what happens when we end up being more loyal, more in love with our man-made systems. It's dangerous. We end up killing people instead of helping. Imagine if, for example, there are people who are maybe, absent from church or absent from Bible study, couldn't attend a ministry event. Can you imagine how comical this would be, how embarrassing it would be if someone would go and say, where were you during? Can you picture it? I noticed you were not here on Sunday. Where were you? I noticed that you were late for Bible study. Where were you? What were you doing? What was more important? How could you miss this or that ministry event? Can you imagine how embarrassing it is if it's in public and then the guy goes, oh, I had to take my mom to the hospital. It was an emergency. Can you imagine how embarrassing it would be for the person? Oh, sorry, bro. I didn't know. Yeah, that's legit. How shameful, no? Interestingly, many times we don't say it out loud, but it's very dangerous if we think it in our heads. We should, in fact, pause and maybe give some kind of benefit of the doubt. You remember before we talked about this, like when people sin against each other in church, no one's thinking along the lines of, I will intentionally offend this friend. I will find a way to insult him to the heart so that he will sin. Like no one's thinking that, right? So we should give the same benefit of the doubt. So someone's late for church. So someone was absent during Bible study. We shouldn't imagine this person going, I will be absent because I will sin with all my might. I will invite evil in my life. Like, why? Why do we do that in our minds? Person is absent. I already know why. This person. We shouldn't. We should probably have the whole mercy versus sacrifice principle and go, I wonder what's up. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe something happened. And then reach out. Hey, bro, what's up with you? Are you okay? Is everything okay? You need help with anything? Then I just noticed you were absent last week on Sunday, and then you were absent again for Bible study. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. For all you know, it's like, oh, I've been sick for a week. Or I broke my leg. I couldn't walk. I just didn't want to chat anyone because I didn't want people to fuss over my broken leg. Oh, how bad is it? Oh, it's a fracture. Huh? Like, it's really bad. No, like, we don't know. We don't know. We have to be very careful. Now, to balance it, we also have to honor our commitments. So if I say for myself, at least, like I want to commit, I want to be in Bible study, I want to do this, I want to go to church, I don't want to miss Sunday service. I also have to honor those things. I'm not saying also for any simple reason, sige na lang, excuse everything. So you see, it's tricky. Like God doesn't give us a list. If he breaks his leg, he must attend Bible study. But if it's a fracture, he's excused. Like, there's no list, right? It's very case to case. It's very heart. It's very motives based. It's very check your heart, and it's all of that. And if God gave us a list, we would find a way to look for technicalities. We would probably end up doing that, as sinful as we are. Like, is it a fracture? Not really. I'll get a second opinion. The doctor says it's almost a fracture. Consider the fracture. Okay, fracture. I'm excused. Like, we have that in our hearts. So it has to be, it's really difficult because we need to find a balance. It's not black and white. There are two extremes, and we need to balance between being firm and showing concern. Right? Like, to challenge people and say, hey, we got to honor our commitments, but at the same time, we got to be, understanding as well. Being strict with certain duties is one side, but the opposite side is understanding struggles of people. What might be simple for me might not be so simple for others. It's a big deal maybe for me, maybe not for others, or maybe it's a small deal for me, but it's a big deal for others. So where's the balance? I cannot say. I honestly don't know. It's very case to case. We need to show a balance between strong convictions and not condemning the weak. What if your convictions are very strong in an area, but another person is not very strong with his convictions in the same area? We have to maybe open up conversation, have dialogue, have discussions graciously, not in a condemning way. Very difficult. The principle is that we should not have a lack of compassion for others, neither should we have an unbiblical loyalty to man-made traditions, expectations, social norms and cultures, and duties that come from wherever. As Christians, the biggest temptation is to have man-made religious expectations. Others codify that into statements of faith, into creeds, into whatever. Others don't say, I've seen other churches that say, we don't have creeds. Our only creed is Christ. I've heard that so many times. And yet when you listen to them talk, they have their church expectations and local church social duties and obligations that if you go against them, they'll condemn you more than the churches that have their creeds. Like, way more. We don't have a creed, but you're absent. How dare you be absent? If we don't have that in our bylaws, it's not in the bylaws, your heart is wicked. Like, I've seen that. And we have to be careful in our own hearts to not judge others too. Not right away. The Bible says to judge rightly. How do we judge rightly? By first talking openly. Get to know what's happening. Many times, here's my biggest fear. We would say this. When I was crafting this, or when I was preparing for the sermon, I asked myself, if I lived during the time of Christ, would I side with Jesus? I really wonder if I would side. Like, okay, if we know who Jesus is today and we went back into the past using a time machine, obviously we'll all side with Jesus because we know He's Lord. But if we grew up during that time not really knowing who Jesus was, that He's Messiah and all of that, like Lord of the Sabbath, Son of Man, etc., right? And we know this is what the religious community is doing, and Jesus says, mercy, not sacrifice. I wonder how many of us would actually say, yes, that's true, or we would say, wait a minute, but the law. what I'm trying to say is, let's not be so quick to assume that we would side with Christ. We have to have that level of humility and say, I might side with the Pharisees actually. If someone would be absent in church, Bible study and all of that, and I ask them why, and they would say, oh, I had a hard time because I was really feeling tired and sick, and so I had to go home because I was so afraid I'd catch a fever. I wonder how many of us would say, yeah, I understand, or how many of us would say fever, lang, just a slight fever. I've had fever before and I attended church. Fever? Or how many people in China would be willing to die and you're afraid of a flu? Like, you see now at the same time, you see the balance, the challenge, the struggle we all have with I don't want to push, but I also don't want to excuse every single excuse or reason. Where's the balance? I don't know. That's for all of us to pray about and to examine our hearts, to talk to one another, to see where each other's at. And maybe there's a way to challenge someone. Not the whole of people in China dying and maybe not that way. Maybe we can talk about it in some other way, maybe have a disclaimer. I understand. Maybe it's difficult, especially if you're the breadwinner. If you have a fever, you can't work. If you can't work, you don't get payments and your salary will get affected and that's going to affect your budget for the month and et cetera, et cetera. Understand that. While at the same time, there's God and there's faith. And I want to leave it between you and God to decide on this. Or I'm really tired. I don't know if you're in the season of so tired you got to take a break, or you're in the season of so tired you need to do ministry to get full back. I don't know which one it is for you. It's different for everybody. Maybe you and God should talk and pray, and I'll pray for you. And you see that? It's a difficult balance, isn't it? I think the end result for us should really be to talk to one another and get advice. Because many times we don't do that, right? We don't even say, I'm spiritually dry. Nobody ever says that. We just say, how are you? I'm okay. The usual. Some ups, some downs. Right now I'm in the down, but probably gonna go up soon. Nobody ever says, I'm really down. I don't know when the up's gonna be. I need to talk to someone. I need someone to talk to me and talk me out of this. How many of us are willing to say, I need someone to slap me in the face and challenge me? Or, I need someone to just pray for me and comfort me. Here's my default. If someone is condemning himself for not doing religious activities, I'd probably go towards the route of, dude, don't condemn yourself. I'm not going to make excuses for you, but I just don't want you to condemn yourself and think you're super sinful already because you're absent here or wasn't able to do this or that. Because your basis is the death of Christ on the cross for your righteousness and not what you do. And yet if someone is always just, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do this, I can't do that, I just can't, then I'd probably go the challenging route. Like, dude, it seems like everything is a reason for you to not do certain things. And there's always going to be a reason in life. Right? Like life will be life. Life will always have demands. And it's never going to disappear. So that's my normal default, but I would still rather talk. Listen and hear people out. So to conclude, just a few things. First, how do we assess ourselves? We know this doctrinally. We assess ourselves in doctrinal ways. We know that, right? Like, I know it's Jesus on the cross. He died for my sins. I'm forgiven. We know this. But functionally, why do you do church work? Why do you do Christian things? Is it because you need to feel religious? I'm used to it. It's Sunday. Of course I'll go to church. Do you come to church because it's Sunday and it's your thing? Well, people expect me to go to church. Why? I need to preach. If you're the preacher or I'm an elder, I'm a deacon, I'm a Bible study leader, I'm influential in church, of course I have to go. Is it that, or is it more, I'm excited. I love the people. I'm excited. I want to hear God's word. I studied this ahead of time. I want to hear a perspective. I want to worship together. I miss God. I miss church. You know, why do we do church stuff? That's the first question. I really hope that these church activities help you experience more grace and growth, and you recognize it and you see it in your life. Like, why do you go to church? I get grace. I condemn myself all week and I hear grace. Or I excuse myself all week and I like how I get slapped spiritually on Sundays. I don't know. But what's your motive? Really? I hope it's not obligation. The second question is this. How do you view religious traditions, expectations, religious social duties today? Maybe coming from your own church here with us, coming from an older church background, if you've come from a different church and you have a different experience, and how do you view all of those things? Lastly, how is your spiritual condition? If you're tired, exhausted, etc., really just look at yourself. Take an honest examination. Is it I don't mind Christian stuff, but I'm not as interested as before. You know what I mean? Like there's I'm so interested, I want to devour this. There's that. And then there's I'm still interested. And there's I'm a Christian. I kind of already know how to live as a Christian, so I just kind of attend stuff and because it's a Christian thing to do. I'm happy with my life. I'm kind of content. So, okay lang. But I'm not as hungry as I used to be. Like, where are you? And when you really look at that about your life, you can really examine. You see, when we do that, we'll really be able to assess ourselves. And when we start assessing ourselves, the first thing you have to really look at is your motives. Because once your motives are clear, then you'll know what to pray for. You won't even start thinking of others. Like the Pharisees, they always thought of everybody else, right? They never assessed themselves. The Pharisees were like, I already know how to live like a quote-unquote Christian or a Pharisee at the time. I'm content with my life. People look up to me. People think I'm religious. I think I'm religious. My peers think I'm religious. Row 1 and row 2 have given me a passing grade. Right? So, okay, nako. I don't need to study the law. I just need to memorize a few key token stuff from the Torah, and that's what I say. The lay people don't even know the Torah, so I'm excused. That's what the Pharisees lived. I'm content. I hope we're not quote-unquote content. I hope we're still hungry. I hope we're not just doing these things out of tradition. I hope we're not evangelizing out of obligation. Why should you evangelize? I have to. Versus I'm concerned. I love. I have compassion. I have mercy for others. Why do we do what we do? The Pharisees, they were row 1 and row 2. They were okay in their own minds. They had a passing grade. For us, we have a true passing grade in Christ. What is our response to that? Amen? Let's pray.